One more guest to come your way here on this Wednesday edition of the show. It's time for our Wednesday Wagering with Wes Reynolds segment. Wes, how's it going today, man?
Hey, Adam. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Appreciate your time, as always, to join us here, sir. We're going to talk some NBA and some NFL with Wes. You can find his work on Twitter at Wes Reynolds and the number 1. Wes, let's go ahead and start with this Thursday night game here. Washington and Dallas. We'll go ahead and dive right in. And, I was surprised when this number opened with Dallas a favorite, albeit just a 1-point favorite. And then we saw the number go up to 1.5. Now it's flipped, where Washington's a 1.5-point favorite. I sort of feel like this is where the number should have been all along. Do you have any idea why the books would open Dallas the favorite, given how they've looked the last few weeks?
I'm not sure why. I mean, it's no surprise that it's moved to where it is right now, because if you look, both these teams were obviously in national TV Thanksgiving games, and Dallas looked awful, and Washington really wasn't great. I think it was kind of the Giants' ineptitude more than anything in that game. But it's no surprise the line has moved this way. And looking at the Redskins this year, they've probably actually been a better team on the road than they've been at home at FedEx Field. If you look at some of their efforts on the road, they were relatively competitive with Philadelphia when nobody, in comparison to kind of their contemporaries of other teams. I mean, they weren't really blown out on Monday night at Philadelphia. They should have probably won at Kansas City if Josh Doxson catches that pass with about a minute to go at Kansas City. They had a big lead at New Orleans that they ended up losing in overtime, but they were pretty much covering and winning the whole way. They went out and won at Seattle. So, I mean, the Redskins have really, I think, had some of their better efforts on the road this year. And meanwhile, looking at Dallas, they've had 2 really embarrassing performances on national TV. They were humiliated at home on Sunday night by the Eagles, just like everybody else has been as of late. And then the performance on Thanksgiving, where they really seem to get nothing going. And I mean, you lose Ezekiel Elliott for the suspension. You have some various injuries on the offensive line. Looks like Tyron Smith is going to play, but Zach Martin is questionable. He's in concussion protocol. Leo Collins is questionable. The defense looked absolutely lost without Sean Lee. And I think if you look at their receiving game, I mean, I think Witten is still their most consistent receiving threat. I don't think Dak has the chemistry with him that Romo did. But, their I guess, a receiver is Dez Bryant, but Dez Bryant's not really gaining separation from defensive backs anymore. So they're just lacking, any type of big play threat. And I think, Dallas looks relatively ordinary lately. And actually the last 2 weeks have been less than ordinary, and they've been pretty bad. So no surprise that this has moved this way. I mean, if I were looking to probably bet the game, I would probably want to maybe tease Dallas up through the 3 and the 7 with maybe a Sunday game, because I still think that there could be value there with Dallas as a home dog taking, over 7. But it's tough to really make a case to take them straight up based on what we've seen lately.
So, what's really interesting, and what my thought process was, I don't think I conveyed it properly at the top of the segment here, but with Dallas opening a favorite, like, people always talk about trap games in the market. People always talk about, the odds makers sort of playing games with you, because they had to know that sharp money would hit the board on Washington early in the week, because Dallas is not a team that should be favored over anybody right now, except for probably the Browns, the 49ers, some of those types of teams, the real bottom feeders. Washington doesn't have a great record, but Washington has a lot of personnel. they have a good quarterback in Kirk Cousins, which goes a long way in today's NFL. So the books had to know that they were getting Washington money here, and it seems like they weren't worried about it, which is something that's kind of sounding alarm bells for me.
Yeah, I think so too. And looking at Washington has their fair share of injuries on defense. I mean, maybe no stars like Dallas has, but in terms of their depth on the defensive line, a little bit in the on the offensive line as well, with Trent Williams, still not ruled in for the Thursday night game. So, Washington's been banged up a little bit too, and I think maybe the books also didn't believe in Washington a ton either. I mean, looking at that performance on Thursday night, I mean, they weren't really ever losing the game, I don't believe, but I mean, they couldn't get away from the Giants, who could do absolutely nothing on offense, who have no running game, who have receivers that drop passes, who have a poor offensive line, and they really couldn't get away from the Giants. So, I think you have two teams here that don't inspire, I guess, a lot of belief, in the market. So this is actually, I think, a really tough game.
All right, let's look ahead to Sunday here, and let's talk about game 355, 356, the Minnesota Vikings on the road against the Atlanta Falcons. Vikings getting 3 here in this spot. And, Wes, we've talked about it a lot here on our segments and on the Super Contest segments when you've filled in for us. There's just so many bad games. Lots of times they're just awful games. Last week's card was terrible. You had multiple double-digit favorites. This week you've got some good games. You've got this Minnesota-Atlanta game, which is a really good one. I think a lot of people sort of feel like Atlanta's turned that corner with 3 straight wins and 3 straight covers. But Minnesota, I mean, how good has this team been? They've covered 6 straight. What do you think about this line? I mean, is this line where it should be? Do you feel like there's an edge to be had in this game?
I think this is probably where it should be. I mean, because looking right now, I mean, Minnesota, I think perhaps has that look maybe a little bit of a public underdog here because, I mean, they're a 9-2 team getting points. So, I mean, you got to think that more of the betting public, who's been obviously doing very well in the NFL the past several weeks, with all these favorites that keep coming in week after week, but they have a look of a dog that I think will see support in the market from the betting public. Atlanta last week, was kind of a deviation from their pattern because they actually really started well against Tampa Bay, and then Tampa Bay came back and made it a game, and then Atlanta, somehow covers at the end of the game, which was kind of a little bit of a tough beat for Buccaneer backers, the way that game closed. But this is also a tough one because, you got to love Minnesota's defense and the fact that they've kind of been able to keep it together. I mean, they have Bridgewater back healthy to go, but they really haven't had to play him because they keep winning, and then Case Keenum has done a good job, so they really haven't had the need to rush him back. And then Atlanta, you're kind of seeing that, hey, this is the Atlanta Falcons team that we expected, that was the Super Bowl contender because they started out so awful, and now they're starting to win games. So I think this is another tough game. I mean, I think it's a very good one. It's not some of the games we've talked about in the Super Contest segments where it was like, oh gosh, what do we do here? But this is a little bit of a what do we do here game because you can make a convincing case, I think, for either side here, and I haven't determined which case I'm going to make for, or which side I'm going to particularly choose here, just because, I think the line is probably where it should be. I mean, if it's 3 and if Atlanta has the standard home field advantage, and I think it could be higher because in big games, that stadium is going to get loud. I mean, I think this is, basically kind of a pick 'em game here.
Well, and, a lot of times when I find games that I like, that I'm going to follow, but I don't necessarily have an opinion on, I like to follow them so that I can maybe pick up something down the line a little bit. Now, I will say that this isn't the greatest of spots for Atlanta, coming off of a division game against Tampa Bay. They played Minnesota here, and then they played New Orleans on a short week on December 7th. So it's kind of that divisional sandwich spot, and we'll see, how the Falcons handle that. But one of the problems that I have with this game, and this is going to be an issue, all week long pretty much in the NFL, is that because we've seen these teams play so many bad teams, because there are so many bad teams in the NFL, it's been really hard to gauge what these performances actually mean. In a spot like this, you never want to overreact to one game, but at the same time, these are two really good teams. So if one team shows out here in this spot, there's going to be that inflation, there's going to be that recency bias, and I think that's a really challenging thing here about this game as well, is that I think you're going to find out a lot about both of these teams, but I don't know how relevant it is to the future, because it may have just been a one-off thing because they're actually playing somebody.
Yeah, I mean, I agree as well, and I think you have, both of these teams look like they're going to be playoff teams. I mean, especially Minnesota. I mean, nobody is really close to them in the division. I mean, it's a 3-game lead with 5 to play. So, I mean, you got to think this team's going to be there. The AFC South is a little bit more competitive. I mean, Atlanta is actually in 3rd place in the AFC South, or the NFC South, I'm sorry, behind 2 teams that play each other this week with Carolina and New Orleans. So, I mean, Atlanta probably, if you look at that in terms of a division race, probably needs the game more. But then again, Minnesota's only 1 game out from home field advantage with Philadelphia. So, I mean, but for the division race, you got to think that, this is kind of where Atlanta needs to make a stand here if they want to keep pace.
One more NFL game that we're going to touch on here, and then we'll take a look at the NBA side of things for a few minutes. You just mentioned this game. Carolina takes on New Orleans. And I just talked about how the Rams seem like they got a nice little inflation for beating New Orleans last week. I think that number against Arizona is a little bit high. In this spot here, it seems like the loss for New Orleans hasn't really deterred anybody. They're a 4.5 point favorite here in this spot. A lot of books showing 4.5 now after the opener of 4 flat. And it just sort of has the look to me like people are willing to completely bypass New Orleans' loss last week.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, and I think that was actually one game I did win in the NFL card last week with the Rams. I mean, I just thought that was a good spot after they had taken their licking in Minnesota, and then New Orleans just looked kind of ready to lose one. I mean, they had a couple close wins, and they had gotten home and happy kind of, and then they had to go on the road, semi across country, and the Rams I don't think really beat them down, but they pretty much had control of the game from the get-go. And now you have Carolina coming in. Now it seems like a lot of the early money has been on the Saints, but the line really hasn't moved. I mean, and Carolina is one of those teams that may be getting some recency bias favoritism here in the fact that they've covered their last few games. They had that impressive performance against Miami on Monday night. They go to the Jets and somehow cover, even though I think that the Jets really were, right there covering the game the whole way. They just had bad circumstances kind of get them. So, I mean, New Orleans is always tough at home. This would be something maybe I would look at, perhaps if I don't want to lay the 4, maybe laying money line and maybe parlaying it with a big favorite that you might feel, this is a smallish favorite, parlayed it with a big favorite that you might feel confident about, perhaps Jacksonville or perhaps the Raiders, something like that. But haven't made a determination yet in terms of where I'm going to go. But I mean, my lean would be with New Orleans, simply because I think that they're actually the better team, and I think being at home, we talk a lot about home field advantages in the league, and some are higher than others. We know that Seattle's is really high. We know that Denver's is really high for the altitude, and probably one of the top 5 or 6 home field advantages in the league is New Orleans, because that place gets very loud, especially when they're running well. And I think, the Saints would be one of those teams that I would have above the standard 3-point home field advantage. So they would be my lean for this game.
One final thing I want to ask you about in the NFL. You mentioned maybe using Oakland as a money line parlay piece here this week. I know the line didn't move based on the announcement of Geno Smith being the starter, which kind of gives you an idea of what Eli Manning is right now and what Eli Manning has done this season. But that entire situation, it just looks so bad to me. I mean, Ben McAdoo is not going to keep that job. He's going to be fired. There's no doubt about it. And to sit down a franchise icon like that with a long games played streak, if you want to go to Davis Webb and see what you've got in him, okay, fine, maybe I get it. We all know what Geno Smith is, and Geno Smith's not going to be a Giant next year anyway. It's awful. It's one of the worst treatments of a player that I've seen in quite some time. Outside of players doing something to get themselves in trouble or whatever. It's inexcusable to me. I don't know if McAdoo's being petty. I don't know if maybe Manning said something to him behind the scenes, or if Manning's big, let's go win one rant in that game a couple of weeks ago, included McAdoo, or maybe took shots at him. But that's ugly. It's a really ugly situation there with the Giants, and I don't know, what effect that has on the field. I mean, do the veterans actually show up and play for this team this week? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a tough call for me as well to determine. I don't think. I think if you were going to go away from Eli Manning, you needed to do that several weeks ago, and make that move. And I think doing this at this point, when you don't have a chance to make the playoffs, when you're not going anywhere right now, doing that and kind of pretty much almost ending his career, Eli's career for him in New York, with a coach that's probably not going to be there next year, that was just the worst way to handle this. I mean, and I think Eli's contract goes through another year, but I mean, he can't want to come back after this. I mean, and I think Eli is one of those guys that, because his father played in the league and obviously his brother, he's one of those old school guys. He is very well aware of NFL history and whatnot. And, he was a guy that it seemed to me wanted to finish his career where he started it. And, now he's got to be looking at the landscape across the league and saying, well, maybe there's a couple places for me to land here. I mean, you got a guy who probably, and he's the ultimate debate because he's not a clear-cut Hall of Famer, but he's not a clear-cut no either. I mean, when a guy has won 2 Super Bowls in a big market, there's a chance he gets the benefit of the doubt. But to have this end in a borderline Hall of Fame career like this, I know a lot of the former Giants that he played with have kind of had his back on social media, and I don't know how that team is going to react anyway. I mean, McAdoo didn't discipline Odell Beckham. He's afraid of Beckham. He didn't discipline him when he should have, and I think the locker room sees that. To say, hey, you're not going to discipline this guy, but yet you're going to sit a 2-time Super Bowl winning quarterback for Geno Smith. That gets to a locker room, I think. And they can see that. And, when we were talking about the Redskins earlier, I mean, the Giants, you could see that they just have nothing. And you almost feel bad for Eli a little bit because they have no running game. The receivers drop balls and all the time on him. And the offensive line, I mean, that last play, where, they got the strip sack fumble. I mean, Eric Flowers has been off and on a turnstile at left tackle for the Giants for the past couple seasons. So, I mean, you don't know what kind of effort the Giants are going to have. I mean, at least the Raiders seemingly have a pulse, because Kansas City has really come back to them in that division when they were undefeated, and now I think they're like 6-5. The Raiders are thinking, hey, as bad as we've had it, we still got a chance at this thing. So, I mean, I couldn't take the Giants.
No, and McAdoo had a big coaching blunder last week again, and this is a guy that's just looked like he's been in over his head for the last 2 years, and it's sad because the Giants, kind of unceremoniously pushed Tom Coughlin out the door too, and then now to do this with Eli Manning as well. I mean, Eli Manning's worked with this guy for 4 years. He was the OC for 2 years before he was the head coach. It's sad. It's a sad state of affairs to see what's going on there, and it's a little bit different than to draw an NHL parallel. The situation with Shane Doan in Arizona, where Shane Doan, wanted to retire a Coyote and did wind up doing that, but they were a team that was very clearly going into rebuild mode, and the dynamics are just different in the NHL. In the NFL, if you're rebuilding but you've got a veteran quarterback that can help out whoever you draft or whatever young quarterback you trade for, that's a good thing. It's like Eli's like having an extra coach there on the sideline. If you want to go through this rebuild process, and you're going to need another coach because McAdoo is going to get fired. But when I saw that come across the wire yesterday, I was dumbfounded. I can't believe that you could treat a player that's meant so much to this franchise and take the Hall of Fame debate out of it. Take the fact that a lot of people say Eli had potential to be a lot better, and he probably did. I mean, what this guy's done for that team, and then to be treated this way by a lame duck head coach, I just don't get it. Anyway, we'll flip over to the NBA side here for a few minutes to talk about that. And, Wes, I want to hit specifically on back-to-backs here because I think we've got 3 really interesting scenarios here tonight on Wednesday night in the NBA. We'll start with the Miami Heat, who got blown out in Cleveland. They only lost by 11, but it was far, far worse than that because it was a 75-49 game at halftime. But Miami took some overnight money, taking on the New York Knicks here. Is that an angle that you look to play? Do you look to play on teams that got blown out the night before playing a back-to-back?
I think it's a lot better than if a team, blows a lead the night before, especially if they blow it in the fourth quarter, which obviously Miami did not. Usually there's carryover early into the next game after letting one get away. So it usually maybe takes a team a little bit to get going the next night. But, Miami did take a little bit of money here. Looks like Enes Kanter is going to be back for the Knicks. He's listed as probable. And, I mean, noticing something about the Knicks, in a lot of these games, they've seemingly gotten off to bad starts and then have some pretty good second halves. I mean, it seems like they've been down in a lot of home games and then all of a sudden kind of pick it up. Didn't happen the other night with Will Kenner was still out, but it didn't happen really the other night with Portland. I mean, they kind of made a little bit of run because Portland didn't score for about the first 6 minutes of the fourth quarter, but still managed to win by double digits and had enough. If I were to play this, I would probably lean with the Heat because looking at the Knicks right now through 20 games, and I usually like to use that 20-game barometer to kind of see where you are as a team because that's how long I think it takes for kind of a team to kind of come together unless they're a total veteran team where all the same pieces were pretty much in the same place from the year before. But, the Knicks, I think, have kind of exceeded expectations a little bit, at least early, being 10-10. I mean, their season win total was in the low 30s, and they're 10-10 a quarter of the way through the season. So, I mean, my lean here would probably be Miami. I mean, I think Miami is kind of what they are. They're about a 500 team. They're capable of beating good teams and putting together really good efforts. And then they're capable the next night of having a really disappointing effort. So, I mean, I think that they are a better team here than the Knicks. And, I would think that a team that has a lot of similar pieces in place that they had last year would come out at least with some kind of renewed focus. So the Heat would likely be the way I would go here.
The first game on the board here for tonight, game 701, 702, Washington takes on Philadelphia. The Wizards obviously without John Wall for the next little while, and hopefully he's able to get fully healthy and be a solid contributor for this team, once we flip the calendar over to 2018. But a really nice win for them yesterday, and not only that, but they were down 51-43 at halftime. So to win 92-89 as a 5-point pop on the road in Minnesota. And this is a Minnesota team that we talked about before the year. A lot of high expectations, a lot of talent, but they have to find a way. They need to learn really how to win. And you lose a game like that to a Wizards team without John Wall kind of speaks, I think, a little bit to how far away they may actually be. But now Washington, a back-to-back with travel to take on a Philadelphia team that was blown out at home by the Cavs on Monday night. But Washington in a back-to-back without John Wall. So are you surprised that this number hasn't gone up on the overnight? Are you surprised that, some shops are even showing a little bit of Washington money?
I think later today you may see some Philadelphia money, but I'm curious to see how a young Philadelphia team reacts to this because if you looked at the last game against Cleveland, I mean, that was kind of, the show 'em who's boss game where I think Cleveland was a little bit up for that, the veteran team who's kind of been the main dog on the block in the Eastern Conference. Now all of a sudden you got these young guns coming up in Philadelphia. This was kind of like, let's let these boys know who's still boss here. And I think, Cleveland, pretty much did a wire-to-wire job on Philadelphia. So I'm wondering how Philadelphia is going to react, and I think maybe that's why you haven't seen a ton of overnight money on them. And then Washington's got to come in with some confidence because, Minnesota was making, because I had Washington last night, Minnesota was making runs and getting away where it's like every time Washington would get close, Minnesota would push it up to 8 or push it up to 10, and then somehow down the stretch, Washington is able to get there. And so that might give them some confidence at least a little bit early in a game. And I think if you're looking perhaps at a first half, I don't think the first half line, I don't see it on my screen as being posted yet. You may want to look at Washington. I think in the first half that comeback is going to carry over through the next night. And then I also think that with Ben Simmons being questionable, maybe that's a reason why you haven't seen a lot of movement toward the Philadelphia side. But I could certainly, make a case for Washington here, at least for the first half. I wonder if there's a little bit of hangover from Philadelphia, after having that confidence and playing very well and obviously being a much improved team this year, finally starting to realize the fruits of the labor in terms of trust the process. But the fact that they came across an elite team and got their brakes beat off of them, you wonder how their focus is going to be for this next game.
One more game that I want to touch on here, and that's with the Phoenix Suns. They take on the Detroit Pistons, game 703, 704. Phoenix with a road win in Chicago yesterday, and we know Chicago is just downright awful. Phoenix actually looks fairly decent here so far this year, 8-14, so they're still not playing a whole lot of defense, but good young players, good core group that they've got there. They're trying to build something. Surprisingly, this team 4-5 on the road, just 4-9 at home. But they get that road win yesterday, and they got that road win over a team that they knew that they could beat. They were a slight dog of 1 point in that game, depending on the shop that you were looking at. But they knew that was a team that they could beat. Detroit, on the other hand here, biggest surprise in the NBA so far, without a doubt. 13-6 on the year. They like Little Caesars Arena. They're 7-2 there in their new home. We're seeing a little bit of Phoenix money here on the overnights and this morning, down from 12 to 11 and 11.5. How do you approach a Phoenix team here that, you wouldn't expect them to be very good on the road because they are a very young team, coming off of a road win, against a team that's on their level or worse, and I would say Chicago's definitely worse. Now they're taking on this Detroit team that everyone's expecting to fall back a little bit. Do you go back to the well with Phoenix again tonight, or do you sort of look at them and say, well, I don't know if I can trust them 2 nights in a row?
Phoenix would probably be actually my look here, because I wonder about Detroit psychologically here, because Detroit has kind of been a little bit of a surprise this year in terms of their start. The fact that for a long time they've had the second best record in the East, and then you have a lot of cynics and a lot of skeptics that thinking, hey, maybe this team's a little bit fraudulent, that they're playing above their head a little bit. But then they go to Boston and win outright and win by 10 points. A Boston team that was relatively finally healthy. I mean, you've had Horford miss a couple games. I mean, even in that streak, I think Kyrie was out for once or twice, and Horford was out once or twice. I don't think ever really in the same game, but all of a sudden, Detroit has this game against Boston where it's like, hey, this is a true measuring stick game. This is a game to really show that we're for real. And then they accomplished that, and now they come back home against a team that they should easily lay over. I mean, you're wondering if this is kind of a good spot for Detroit to lay an egg here against Phoenix, who I think has been at least a little bit better since they made that coaching change to Jay Triano. I mean, I think that they've been a little more consistent. I mean, defensively, they're not very good, and they're very young. But, they do have some talent on this team, and they have a lot of freaky athleticism on this team. And, I think they put the Bledsoe thing behind them. I mean, to be 8-14 right now is actually probably quite an accomplishment, considering you fired your coach, considering Eric Bledsoe wanted out and you had to trade him. To kind of put all that drama behind them in the past. So, the way I would look here, and I think at least the early market returns here are kind of showing that, I would look to Phoenix here. I think, this could be a game where Detroit, has that proverbial letdown off that win in Boston, where it's kind of like where they psychologically now consider themselves on another level, that they beat the best team in the Eastern Conference, potentially the best team in the NBA, at least so far this season, and now they come and play, one of the lower teams and a very young team, and, maybe they lay an egg, or maybe they don't have their best effort and let this team hang around a little bit.
A lot of good insights on today's show from Wes Reynolds. You can follow his work on Twitter at Wes Reynolds and the number 1. Wes, thank you so much for joining me, man. I appreciate it, and we'll talk to you again next week.
All right, Adam. Safe travels, man.